Great. Well, thank you. I don't know if there's any particular order to present these in, but I'm more than happy to kick things off. So just to introduce myself, my name is Richard Wingfield. I work for Global Partners Digital. We're a human rights organisation based in London, focusing on the internet and digital technology, and we've been part of the UK government's multi-stakeholder delegation at the ITU's Plenipotentiary Conference and ITU engagement for a number of years now. And so I was in Dubai, which was slightly warmer than London. It's been a slight adjustment coming back here, to be honest, but very relieved to be so, as I'm sure you'll find out in a few minutes. Can I start by asking, can you put your hands up if you've heard of the International Telecommunications Union? Okay, fantastic, excellent. Now keep your hands up if you can. So hands up if you've heard of the ITU, and keep your hands up if you would be happy with the ITU playing a leading role in internet governance and regulation of ICTs. Well, I'm disappointed to hear that, because half the world would take a different view, as I've learnt over the last 3 weeks. The ITU's Plenipotentiary Conference was, in theory, supposed to discuss a wide range of issues relating to telecommunications, infrastructure, and to a certain extent ICTs, but in reality the conversation was, as has been the case now probably for 6, 8, 10 years now, dominated by issues relating to internet governance and the role of the ITU within that. A number of key issues came up this time that I want to sort of run through briefly, and it's interesting as I was looking through the agenda of today's event that pretty much every subject that's been talked about as part of this UK IGF was also a subject for discussion at the ITU, whether that's child online protection, cybersecurity, data protection and privacy, artificial intelligence. All of these exciting topics were discussed at the Plenipotentiary Conference, with very strong efforts made by a number of governments, primarily from the Arab region, Russia and many of the former Soviet states, supported by states in Africa, calling for the ITU to be doing more on these issues, to have a greater role in internet governance broadly, but also regulation and standard setting on some of these technologies as well. So very strong efforts were made, with a number of new resolutions being put forward for the ITU to be engaging on issues like over-the-top services, on big data, on artificial intelligence, calls for its existing mandate, where it has a limited scope to engage on issues of cybersecurity and internet governance, for that mandate to be increased. I can report back that thankfully, thanks to the very hard efforts of many states who took an opposite view, probably shared by almost everybody in this room, to resist those efforts for an increased mandate expansion, that those were by and large very successful. You had a what felt like an almost 50-50 split during the conference between those 3 regions of the world that are pushing for the ITU to be doing more on these issues, and 3 regions, by and large, Europe, the Americas, and strongly supported by Australia, New Zealand, Japan, for those efforts to be resisted. And I think it's worth noting that the UK itself played a critical role in those discussions as well, and we're fortunate to be in a country where the UK government and the representatives at the ITU took a very strong stand and coordinated a lot of the work that led to those successful outcomes. But just to get into a little bit more detail about a couple of the points that were discussed, as I mentioned previously, new areas of work were sought to fall within the ITU's mandate, particularly around AI, big data. Efforts were made in relation to cybersecurity for the ITU to start doing more normative work, standard setting, again calls for the development of a global cybersecurity treaty that the ITU would lead on. Within internet governance, more explicit language about the ITU's role, playing a leading role, in fact, when it comes to issues of internet governance and certain aspects around that, whether that's policy matters or domain names, and a real reluctance within any of those discussions for any recognition of multi-stakeholderism as a principle. So whether you are talking about policy making when it comes to cybersecurity, AI, whatever it is, any sort of suggestion that this work should be done in multi-stakeholder processes was strongly resisted by a number of states who would largely prefer to keep that within the realm of either nation states or in multilateral processes. So perhaps not some sort of unsurprising results there, which were thankfully restrained. And I think that one thing that I've learned as part of this work is the much greater need for attention to be paid to the ITU as a forum. I think it's wonderful that the majority of people here have heard about it, but I think when compared to other international processes, the ITU tends not to attract so much attention. But some very real and serious issues were being discussed over the last 3 weeks in Dubai. And without the efforts of the UK government and others, we could be drifting towards a situation where a lot of regulation, where a lot of standard setting will be developed on issues like these in a very closed forum. So I think there's a role for all of us to make sure that this forum does not become forgotten about, but also to raise greater attention to it. And I think this will remain the case in the upcoming years. The issues that were discussed are repeatedly raised within all forums at the ITU and will come up again over the next few years. I think in the medium term, we'll be looking at the WTSA in 2020. There'll be another World Telecommunications and Policy Forum in 2021, and of course, the Plenipotentiary Conference in 4 years' time as well. And it's never too soon to start thinking about how engagement within those processes can be increased, not just within the UK, but externally, because I think one thing that the UK does extremely well is by having multi-stakeholder delegations and national processes that feed into its proposals at the ITU. Real benefit comes from that, and that's something that we don't see in many other countries around the world. I'm lucky enough to be a civil society representative on a delegation. I think there were perhaps only 7 or 8 other countries around the world that included people from outside government, regulators, and maybe a couple of the major big companies involved. So I think the UK's model is one that works extremely well. It would be great to see that amplified and emphasized elsewhere, whether that's with our colleagues in the European region, in CEP, whether that's through the Commonwealth, whether it's through the UK's fellow members on the Freedom Online Coalition, the 30 governments around the world committed to a free, open and secure internet. In fact, the FOC, the Freedom Online Coalition, released a statement just before Plenipot calling for such multi-stakeholder expertise to feed international processes. So it would be great to see some more of the work that the UK has done there being publicised and encouraged in other parts of the world as well. I'm going to pass over, because I'm conscious of time, to some of my colleagues, but if there's sort of an opportunity to dig into some of the more specific details and the issues that were raised at Plenipot, I'm more than happy to chat about them at the end.
Yes, I think if there are any questions pertaining to Dubai action, maybe you could take the questions now. I wasn't personally in Dubai, but followed, and I'm glad that you are part of the civil society, part of the UK delegation. But we have a question over there.
It's not a question, it's a comment. I've been to ITU Plenipots. They're deeply frustrating events, and I share many of the reservations which you're expressing and other people in this room would express. But actually, I think it's also important to understand why so many developing countries feel that the ITU is so important to them, and that's because they don't feel represented in other internet governance bodies. It is a place in which developing country governments and other stakeholders from developing countries feel they get a say. So I think it is really important to take a constructive view towards how the ITU can develop and how participation in that can be more inclusive, as well as defending the positions of northern industrial governments or northern industrial countries within that. So I'm not being negative about the positions of I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm saying there is a need to understand why within the international context of communications policy, the ITU is considered very important by developing countries, and we should respect that.
I think that's right. If I can respond very, very briefly to it, I mean, I think you're absolutely right within that, and I think there needs to be a greater understanding, which perhaps I skipped over in my sort of shortish statement, about why there are actors at the ITU that take the positions they do and why the institution takes some of the positions it does. But I will retain a degree of skepticism about it as well. There were instances where we saw some delegations literally giving the lines to be taken by other states, literally giving pieces of paper to states, telling them what they should be saying when it came to certain resolutions. So I think definitely there needs to be a greater understanding, but I think it's important not to forget the political motivations as a key aspect to that as well.
Okay, there's more questions.
Thank you. How can we encourage the multi-stakeholder model in developing countries that don't necessarily have a robust civil society without risking coming across as colonialist?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think it's part of a broader question about the role of civil society within a number of countries. There were, I can see my colleague Ollie, who led our work on the artificial intelligence within the ITU's Plenipot, and when there was a reference to civil society during one of the discussions, a number of member states asked what civil society was because they didn't understand the term, how genuine they were about that, or whether they were sort of dismissing the idea of civil society's involvement, I don't know. I think there is a fear within some governments of what civil society does. I think it's in sort of states where maybe the government isn't always as powerful as it would like to be, that it can be seen as a sort of a threat to power, whether bringing litigation, whether challenging policy decisions, that somehow civil society disrupts the work of government and interferes with it. And I think that approach needs to be countered, definitely, and that we need to look at strengthening the role of civil society within these countries more broadly, rather than specifically at the ITU. But I think the UK can do some work in that, as I mentioned, which is to emphasise how, I don't want to sort of speak for myself necessarily, but how civil society can add value to the experiences of governments, to bring in particular levels of expertise on certain issues, to provide support and information that government may not have necessarily, and that it can be a constructive partner within multi-stakeholder processes rather than always an obstacle or something that needs to be challenged. So I think there just needs to be a greater understanding and an emphasis of the constructive role that civil society can play. But of course that's very difficult in many countries where civil society is likely going to be disagreeing a lot with what government will want to do. So it's not an easy question to answer. I think there were two hands up here.
Well, actually, just another comment, really. You didn't ask why we all took our hands down when you asked your question about the ITU. I want to relate the experience I had just after the Spectrum, the 4 yearly Spectrum meeting. I happened to be having lunch with the chief scientist at one of the world's largest mobile phone company, China Mobile. And I asked her what a reaction to the ITU Spectrum. She said, well, we didn't get anything. None of our Asian country partners, like India, Korea, Japan, got anything either. We can't wait another 4 years, so we're going to go and do our own thing. At the Alibaba launch, 3 weeks ago in the UK, they put their standards slide up, and the top row was all Asian standards. Now, what are we doing to comply with what they're doing, and are we moving fast enough out of it? I totally endorse what you're doing with the developing countries, or what they're doing with the developing countries, but we need to keep up to speed with the fast runners as well. And that was basically the comment.
Patrick Curry again. I'm actually an ISO editor on 4 committees, and I'm an ITUT guest advisor in the cyber realm. And yes, I would concur with a lot of the challenges that you describe, and there's a lot of frustration in certain quarters. What I have found in my experience is the Council of Europe is a very good vehicle for addressing. Council of Europe is much, much bigger than Europe. It's more than twice the size of the EU. What has been very interesting in that is the discussions that we've had in relation to the Commonwealth Cybercrime Initiative in the UK, which was a really, really good hearts and mind initiative to help former, members of the Commonwealth and former colonies get together and sort out their legal frameworks, otherwise they can't prosecute, the training for their police, otherwise they can't even detect, and so on and so forth. And what was interesting is that several former French colonies in Africa complained bitterly that they didn't get the support that they needed. So that started a dialogue with the French government, who then started to have a discussion about what they were doing to help in Benin and so on and so forth, which started a discussion with the Dutch government about what should happen in Asia. And what was interesting then is other nations came in who had nothing to do with any of those former colonial powers to say, what can we do to help, like South Korea in our case. So my point is, I think there's an awful lot of bilateral and multilateral activity that can take place without waiting for this monolith called the ITU to step forward and do something. There are many other vehicles, and what's needed is a much more coordinated approach within individual nations so that they can engage with a lot of these international bodies. We're not very good at that in the UK, and I think that the CCI, Commonwealth Cybercrime Initiative, was a particularly underrated and very well received vehicle, and unfortunately it's shrunk significantly. And I know that vehicles like that could be really useful. In that same vein, follow the money. That's what the criminals do, so should we. DFID has an awful lot of power because it has an awful lot of ring-fenced money. I am not aware, and I'm glad to be corrected if somebody wants to, what is DCMS doing, as not a criticism, what could it do to work with DFID and DIT to help the economic side of development work? Why is it that the German government is currently funding some cyber initiatives and economic initiatives in Commonwealth countries in Africa? Why aren't we doing that?
Well,
and that, I think, would go a long way to help resolving some of the things that we've talked about. Sorry.
Well, yes, I will leave that to my friends and colleagues at DCMS. But I think I just want to pick up on one very quick point before I pass over. And I think that's one of the reasons that the ITU is attractive is that capacity building that it can provide. And I think that's absolutely critical. And that a lot of support can be offered and other organisations to help countries build the infrastructure and the other sort of capacity gaps that they have to be able to address some of these challenges. I think one of the concerns I have about some of the stuff that goes in the ITU is that the answer is not always regulation and standard setting. It's not always, let's get a treaty to deal with this issue. OTTs are challenging our income, so let's regulate them. So that's my worry, is that because it's a regulatory standard setting forum, that it becomes attractive because it feels like an easy way to deal with a problem, and actually it's a lot more complicated, and the ITU isn't always the best person to help address some of those broader policy issues. So I'm going to, unless there are any more questions, I'm conscious I'm going to pass it over to Desiree.
Thank you, Richard, and yes, welcome to our Mark and Mine's 171 sessions abridged IGF report in less than 10 minutes. So I'll just start with maybe giving some basic stats and then asking what was different, why was this IGF important, and what is the main focus where we can get into more important discussion how to strengthen and change and shape the IGF going forward. So it's not a misnomer to say that good governance starts at home, so whatever we do here at our IGF would actually reflect on the global IGF and all the regional, national and IGFs as well, and youth nationals will help shape the new IGF. So what was different, maybe to start from this, is this was the first IGF out of the 13 one so far where the Secretary General actually was present, and he addressed all the 3,000 participants, 2,000 present and 1,000 online. And three things that he has mentioned is that we should really look into changing the IGF as a multidisciplinary forum where we would invite some experts that usually do not come to these meetings, like philosophers and anthropologists and so on. And I think he also made a big point saying that we should really address the point of outreach for the global IGF, whereby weak voices that have no way of expressing themselves and participating in this global IGF should be encouraged or somehow helped to participate. I think lastly he did made a call and asked everyone to work better on the language that we use at the IGF, so there's some consistency and more understanding among the IGF participants. So as we know, the IGF, the global one, is not necessarily closely linked to the UN, but it's more attached to it, and it's one arm detached, if you like, and self-funded event by the stakeholders. And what was interesting is that President Macron made a very interesting speech that had the opening session that left most of us thinking a lot of what he meant, because he was really alluding to the changes of the IGF in terms of IGF having concrete policy outcomes. And as you know, IGF has been set up to be a policy shaping rather than a policy decision-making body. And that is something that he emphasized, in addition to saying that it is important to really see Europe as a new regulatory powerhouse between the East and the West, I think, and there's a lot in there. What he did say, didn't say, one thing, and this is our personal view, is that he mentioned a word multilateral quite a few times, which was then not understood really well by translators, whether it was multi-acteur, which means a multi-stakeholder, but I think that sent a really important question because it would change the basis nature of the IGF, which is bottom-up forum set up in a multi-stakeholder framework. So I think maybe that's important to say. The topic, as we can see, it was trust in the internet, and I think apart from many busy sessions that were there, we could see that in the corridors people are saying, is it trust in the technology? Can we build trust with the technology? Or is it trust also behind the people and institutions that are running this institution, helping us to curb the negative influences of the internet and try and build on the positive effects of the internet. You can see it was a busy meeting, but the good news is there were about 43% of gender diversity as well, female participation at the IGF. There was a substantial attendance from France, UK, but also Brazil and African region. So it has covered and had a diverse participation. There were about 35 remote hubs and a large population, I think, from African region participate via these 35, some of these 35 remote hubs. So it's maybe good to know that the way how the multi-stakeholder advisory group worked, it really looked at these 8 pillars and to be behind all the 171 sessions that took place in 3 days in Paris only last week. And they looked at cybersecurity, trust and privacy, and there are key messages that you can find further on the website of the IGF. So the main themes were segregated in these categories: development, innovation, and economic issues, digital inclusion, in accessibility, human rights, gender, and so on. And youth, emerging technology, there was a lot of talk about AI and ethics and blockchain for good, as well as evolution of internet governance, which I hope will address, as well as media and content, fake news, and regulation. There were some novelties, and that's one of the things I'd like to point out, is that the internet technical community also proposed and was present quite firmly with some difficult topics about consolidation in the network, and what does that mean for developers and for all the companies developing standards and protocols if there is a huge concentration and consolidation on the very pattern of the internet traffic. So these are some of the mega trends that were discussed, encryption as well, and there's a lot of MEPs in the audience, so that bridge has been built, and Main Internet Society also helps highlight some of the issues. There was a lot of sessions on cybersecurity, and there were a lot of dynamic coalitions taking place, but one of the new ones that has been launched was the DNS coalition on domain name system and universal acceptance, meaning trying to cover some of the acceptance of various scripts and how to bring more attention to developers and companies working in this area to make multilingual scripts acceptable. So I already said what was different. It was that this IGF was not a standalone event. It was actually packed and in between the Paris Forum and the Digital Week, Paris Digital Week, and also I think maybe there's some more things that have happened there, and that was the so-called Paris Appeal, or Paris Call for Trust and Security, which I believe the UK has signed, and maybe Mark would fill in on that. There was also an opportunity for people in the open forum to give input straight to the Secretary General about the UN high-level panel that has been formed in July this year, 18th of July. So what are the issues? I think this is still an outstanding think that there are too many sessions, and some of us have started thinking about this and providing input, and I think there's a working group and there's constantly an open call for collaboration and providing feedback even on this Paris IGF, how we could improve and have more dynamic discussion and have more concrete recommendations, or something that would be conducive for policymakers when they leave the IGF and go and develop policy. So I think also it's not a secret that financial support is one of the IGF. Trust is something that needs a really good care and needs more support and more diversity, because it's not funded by the UN but by the stakeholders. And before I just put these slides, you can read more on these follow-up links, because there is currently a draft of the IGF chair with some of the key messages, and it's not been completed, so you can read more about this, and we can discuss this further. But some of the organizations that were there, like, made also their own reports every day. So it was like Digital Watch made every day IGF report, and I find that also very useful. I think I'll open this up to Mark, and also a call on David Souter to announce something that I've missed to say.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Is this song?
So
David first.
So the thing that I would do is something else that happened at UNESCO, in fact, yesterday, which is that it reached agreement on the Internet Universality Indicators, which have been under discussion for around 2 years, and the subject of, I think, probably the biggest multi-stakeholder consultation process any UN body has done around the Internet governance. So these are indicators which are intended to look at, to enable national assessment of national internet environments on the basis of rights, openness, accessibility, that's their term for access, and multi-stakeholder participation, plus cross-cutting factors such as sustainable development, gender, children, and trust and security. So it's an important new framework, and I think one of the things that I'd emphasize about it is that in the discussion yesterday, while there were a couple of the usual suspects that were amongst member states that were negative about the proposal, there was very strong backing from both developed and developing countries for it. And I think that a lot of that resulted from the extensive work which UNESCO had done to ensure the engagement of all stakeholders there, including the governments of developing countries.
Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you, David. Mark Carvel from the DCMS international team. I was in Paris for the IGF. The weather report on that was, well, it was fairly drizzly and murky, and the Eiffel Tower disappeared into low cloud and so on. But the French government did a pretty good job hosting this IGF. They came in, I think, in February, in the absence of a credible proposal to host it. So, all credit to the French for doing that. And I have to say, there was a sense of scrutiny in the air about the value of the IGF and its long-term sustainability. What is it? Just 3 years after the mandate was renewed by the UN General Assembly, up to 2025, but here we were hearing President Macron talking about reform of the IGF, and indeed the UN Secretary General Guterres saying that, well, the IGF has to adapt to what's going on, and there's a lot of stuff going on, a lot of initiatives. The Secretary General has his own initiative, his high-level panel on digital cooperation. There was a presentation by panel members at that, including the UK member, Cathy Mulligan from Imperial, who's an expert on cryptocurrencies. So there's the high-level panel, and of course the questions arising from that is what role would the IGF play in implementing the recommendations from that panel expected in May next year. By the way, there's a call for contributions, and the initial deadline for that is the end of this month. So if you are minded to respond to that request for comments on values and principles, how principles can be embedded in projects of cooperation in the digital area, examples of digital cooperation that succeed, what are new modalities that could be adopted, you've got very little time because the deadline is the end of this month. But it will continue to receive contributions, but don't miss that initial deadline because it'll inform their initial report. So there's the UN Secretary General's high-level panel. What will the IGF role be for that? And a strong message from the Secretary General, really, that the IGF could step up to the mark in breaking down the silos of digital transformation, discussions taking place on health, education, development, and different fora. But there's the opportunity, really, to break down those silos, and perhaps the IGF couldn't fulfill that role. So as Desiree referred to, there are quite a few challenges ahead for the IGF. We can look forward to a very strong one, and again in Europe next year in Berlin in November. The German government are going to host it. So that's 3 European hosts in a row. That doesn't look good for a global multi-stakeholder forum. So 2020 and beyond, we really need to see this valuable meeting place for stakeholders worldwide take place in Africa or Asia, Pacific, somewhere where that will enhance the inclusivity, because it didn't seem to me in Paris that there was strong diversity from across the world. There were African stakeholders there, certainly from Kenya, Nigeria, but I didn't get a sense of a very strong African presence, nor from Asia, South Asia in particular, India. I don't think there was very strong presence from India, one of the biggest internet populations. So, the IGF has evolved well. It's been on a good track, and the MAG, the advisory group, has put a lot of effort in implementing the various recommendations that have come its way from the CSDD, from the UN retreat a couple of years ago, which we UK government contributed to, and from the stockholder feedback. But it's got a lot of work to do in terms of getting that outreach and communication strategy, and also the valuable work that potentially will come out of its intersessional activity on best practice and connecting and enabling the next billions. What impact are those processes going to make in material terms in contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals? We don't really have a strong sense of measure of that, so a lot of challenges. I'll finish on that with we UK government, I think for the first time we had about 20 policymakers there. That reflected the very rich program that Desiree described. And I spoke in the final session to encourage other governments to get along to the IGF in a similar way in those kinds of numbers. But I'll stop there, and I want to hear from you guys, especially those who were there and those who didn't go, why you didn't go. So, yep, we're over time. Okay. All right.
If you have any questions, we do have more drinks afterwards. So again, if anyone would like to discuss this in more detail with the panel, do feel free to do it then. I think moving through quickly, so the next panel is on cybersecurity and the Internet of Things. Thank you very much to the panellists for speaking just now, very much appreciated.